Chapter 8. Vulnerability. I met a homeless man in London early one Sunday morning. Our brief exchange left a lasting impression upon me. I had just left the hotel with the intention of travelling to King's Cross Station to catch the train home to Scotland when I passed the man on the street. He was carrying what seemed to be his worldly belongings in a cluster of carrier bags, 2 or 3 on each hand. He looked so very sad and tired, and was walking slowly. I walked on, but part of me couldn't forget him. When I reached the street corner, I looked into a cafe where people were sitting in the warmth, protected from the cold. I thought of going in to grab a coffee, and as I stood there, about to open the door, I glanced back and watched the man shuffle slowly across the street. I felt as though I was looking in 2 windows at once. In one were the warmth of the coffee shop and the taste of freshly ground coffee, and in the other was the homeless man, alone on this cold, damp Sunday morning, with nowhere to go to keep him warm. I went back, crossed the street, and found him sitting down in a shop doorway. I thought he was around 60 years old, but up close he looked about the same age as me, only aged by loneliness and cold. I placed £10 in his hand. What happened next has left an imprint on my soul. Looking up at me, he made a prayer, sign of thanks, with his hands. He said nothing, but he didn't need to. Never have I witnessed such gratitude in a person's eyes. His were piercing blue, reminding me of those of Jesus of Nazareth in the movie of that name. He seemed holy in that moment, completely vulnerable, special. I, on the other hand, felt ashamed and small. Should I have given him more? I realized that he saw himself as beneath me in his view. In his view, I and others could choose to bestow upon him money or food as we saw fit, and could somehow decide his fate. I walked away, fighting back the tears. I thought angrily, "No, you are not beneath me, dear sir. You are not beneath anyone. You have a right to happiness." I said a prayer for him and imagined him knowing his worth and finding happiness. It made me feel a little bit better, even though I still wish I could have met him again and do more for him. When we show our vulnerability, others see our greatness. As I blended back into the crowd, not showing mine, hiding among the hundreds of people going about their lives, many also pretending, I felt small and weak. In that simple exchange, the homeless man was most definitely the better man. You see, I've come to measure greatness in the courage to bear one's soul. He showed his. I hid mine behind my wallet and my nice clothes. I choose not to show my emotion as I offered that small sum. I chose not to say anything. I simply smiled, touched his hand lightly, stood up and walked away. He, on the other hand, showed complete openness. I think that's why he penetrated through my guard so much. He was completely vulnerable. There was absolutely no pretense, just 100% authenticity. And in that moment, he was enough. I wasn't. It's hard not to be shaken to your core when someone shows real authenticity and vulnerability, especially when it contrasts so much with your own space. We're so unused to it that when it happens, it almost knocks us off our feet. But vulnerability is the doorway to love, friendship, and lasting relationships. It's the doorway to a sense of connection and belonging. It's the doorway to being enough. The homeless man's authenticity and vulnerability affected me so much that I still feel connection to him. It's why I've been so moved to write about it in this book. Even though we might never meet again, we will be connected forever. His vulnerability facilitated that. It also ensured that his soul has now touched the lives of countless people reading this book. That's the power of vulnerability. Being vulnerable doesn't mean that we need to be an open book and bare our soul to everyone that we meet, but it does invite us to let our guard down. And it has to be authentic. Some people open up to get attention, but they do it to get people to like them. That's not real vulnerability. Real vulnerability can only be authentic. If it's not authentic, it's not vulnerable. Anyone can tell the difference. Vulnerability demands honesty with ourselves and honesty with others. It takes courage, but that courage says, I am enough. Sure, it can be scary. We're saying, this is who I am. It doesn't matter whether you accept me or not. Here I am anyway, and there's always a chance that we won't be accepted. But when we're true to ourselves, that really doesn't matter at all. In those fleeting moments, somewhere deep down, we know that being true to ourselves is enough. Authenticity and vulnerability both equate to enough. We needn't hide in case someone sees the real us. And showing other people who we really are is the pathway to connection. Of course, this means being honest with ourselves. It means accepting our imperfections and not hiding them. It means being honest with others. It means not holding back. It means showing how we feel. It means risking rejection. It means stepping out of our comfort zone. It means vulnerable. We show vulnerability when we write, build, create a product or perform and put what we do or have created out into the world for people to see, knowing that they might not like it or us. We're vulnerable when we have to do difficult conversations with our partner, children, or co-workers. We're vulnerable when we initiate sex, knowing that we might be rejected. We're especially vulnerable when we choose to love someone completely, even though we know we might get hurt. Vulnerability is asking an employer for what we need, even though they might say no. It's admitting that we're afraid, knowing that people might think we're weak. It's being honest about feeling sad when people expect us to be happy. Part of my personal vulnerability in this book is sharing some of my own weaknesses. When you've written 7 previous books in the self-help field, people expect you to be whole and wise, to have all the answers and certainly not to have any personal problems. When I started writing this book, I thought people would be asking, how can a person with personal difficulties write a self-help book? I was afraid that they wouldn't hold me in the same esteem as before. Maybe they'd stop coming up to my talks because they'd think that I wasn't as healed as other authors. I was even afraid that I wouldn't have anything significant to say and that no one would want to read a self-help book written by a man. Those were the risks, I suppose, that swarm around in my mind. But I actually feel relief as soon as I began allowing audiences to learn how I've stumbled through my life at times, how I've had to feel my way into the dark, how I've struggled and still struggle. What I didn't expect was people telling me that they appreciated my honesty and had become stronger in themselves through learning that I had the same problem as they had. Rather than my audiences getting smaller as people realize I'm no better than they are, they've become larger as people understand that if I can do it, despite my challenges, then they can too. And so can you. Self-love gym. Love thyself challenge. Earlier, I suggested that you loved yourself regardless of how you were feeling. So here's a vulnerability challenge. Take a few selfies of yourself throughout the week that show yourself not just as at your best, but at your worst. Let your selfies show how you really feel in both your happy moments and your sad ones. Share them on social media using the hashtag #IHeartMyself or simply #IHeartMe. The worst day of my life was when a specialist told us that Oscar, then only 22 months old, had bone cancer. That there was nothing we could do, and that at best he had about 6 months to live. We could add 3 months to his by amputating his leg, but we'd need to weigh that up against the loss of quality of the remainder of his life. It was unexpected. Life can throw curveballs from time to time. I won't go into it in too many details here. It all happened very recently. If you want to read more, I've placed a little update in the afterword. The initial impact this had on us was traumatic, but this is also a story about allowing yourself to be vulnerable and the magic that you allow into your life when you do. Elizabeth has always been a very private person. She's never let her guard down. Even when bullied at high school, she never let the bully see her scared. Even when her parents learned of it and took her out of school a year early, she never let them see her real pain. In all the years we've been together, I have never once known Elizabeth to tell anyone other than family and close friends anything significant about her life, about her real hopes, dreams, aspirations, or especially her fears. Nor would she ever show emotion. Oscar's diagnosis changed all that. In the days that followed, Elizabeth cried in front of people she hardly knew. She cried in front of our vets, Shelley, Stephanie and Helen, and the nurse, Louisa. She cried on the street when we told some neighbours and people who had dogs Oscar liked to play with. She cried in front of near strangers. The magic was that Elizabeth allowed other people to care, and in doing so, she created a little opening that invited them into her life for the first time ever. In the process, she entered a little into theirs too. She allowed them to empathise and extend their compassion, sometimes with a caring face, sometimes with a gentle touch, and other times just by sharing the space and allowing her to be how she needed to be right then. She allowed them to connect. Vulnerability and compassion both invite relationships into a new space. They both break down any pretense. When we show compassion, we are being ourselves. When we feel someone's pain, we are being ourselves. When we show our pain, we are being ourselves. I had a similar experience to Elizabeth. When faced with sudden difficulty, I tend to get clarity and focus. In some ways, this is very useful because I tend to focus on a solution and move quickly to activate it. The downside is that I bottle up pain. Shifting my focus so quickly doesn't mean that the pain goes away. I just ignore it. The day of the diagnosis, I went over to see my mum and dad. Like many families, we're not used to showing emotion in front of each other. Not since I was a child have I shown emotion in front of my dad. But that day, when Mum hugged me, I cried. Coming out of the hug with my mum, I looked over at my dad, and he quickly looked away. It wasn't a conscious decision, more a reflex reaction. He just didn't know what to say or do. Usually when I'm leaving to go back home, Mum comes to the door and gives me a hug goodbye. Dad usually just says goodbye from his chair, but this time he followed me to the door too. The following week at my niece's 7th birthday party, Dad came to the door as well. It was his way of being there for me, and I understood it. Simple though the gesture was, it brought a new depth and quality to my relationship with my dad. Expressing my pain added a new dimension to my relationship with my mum too. I was giving her a chance to be my mum and pour out her compassion, and I was able to witness a part of her I'd seen so often when I was a child. Circumstances sometimes force us to be vulnerable. They ask us to step up, not to be stronger in the classical sense, but to shake off all the pretense and just stand there naked. In those moments, it really doesn't matter what anyone thinks, but we give others permission to care. We invite them to be human. And that's the magic of vulnerability. Letting our guard down and being authentic is about the most important thing we can ever do. We just need to convince ourselves that the benefits far outweigh the risks. Okay, the risks. People might not like us. We might be distanced from a group. We might lose one or more of our relationships. People might say that we've changed and get angry with us. Okay, so the benefits. We let go of the stress of pretending we're something we're not. We can relax in our own private moments without wondering how we're going to keep up pretense, or without resenting the people around us for expecting us to be something that we're not. We might find that people show us a level of respect that we've never known before. We know that people who leave our life weren't good for us anyway, because they only liked the version of us that we'd been showing them. We make room in our life for people who love us for real, and we draw these people into our life. We form deeper, more authentic and meaningful relationships, and we become healthier. These are just some of the risks and benefits. Ones that are fairly general. I'm certain that you can think of more in your own life, ones that relate more personally to you. That's why I'd like you to have a go at it yourself. It's an important exercise, so here's what to do. Consider these questions and write down your answers. 1. What benefits would being more authentic bring you specifically? For example, which of your relationships would being authentic affect, and how might they be affected? Would it affect your career? 2. What actions could you take or conversations could you have in the next few days that would help you to be more authentic? You can't be enough while you're hiding your true self, because the act of hiding affirms that you think that you're not enough. Why else would you be hiding? Being authentic is about showing yourself as you really are. Enough says, I am here now as I am. Being authentic means showing your vulnerabilities, but as I mentioned earlier, that isn't about being a book that's open for everyone to see everything about you. It's about asking yourself if your authenticity or more vulnerability would be good for you and in which circumstances. It might only mean a small amount of opening up and letting your guard down, or it might mean a lot. We're all different. Personally, I'm learning to be more open and honest with more people. This has included sharing some personal examples in this book that I've not written out before. This was a little out of my comfort zone, but not too much. But I also have a small number of family and close friends with whom I share certain things that I wouldn't necessarily share with others. That's my inner circle, so to speak. Self-love is about learning what works for you as an individual. There are times when vulnerability isn't the right thing. It can lead to being taken advantage of. That's always a risk, and one that we can't always avoid. My friend Gillian reminded me of this. She told me that being vulnerable came naturally to her, but she had to learn not to be such an open book. This was especially true during a time when she lost some members of her family. She was treated very poorly when she was at her most vulnerable, and this was very isolating. Instead of acceptance and belonging, vulnerability led to loneliness for her. Gillian learned that it was only safe to be vulnerable with certain people. This was a valuable lesson. The act of showing vulnerability in the presence of specific people shows that we are enough far more than opening up to everyone. It becomes an empowered choice, and that shows that we are in a state of enough. In summary, allowing ourselves to be vulnerable is a way to build the feeling that we are enough. Holding back is usually done out of fear of what people might think, but allowing that fear to call the shots only says that I am not enough. Being vulnerable looks fear in the eye and says, I will not hide. Here I am, now, as I am. Vulnerability is part of being authentic. It's opening up to the world as we are. There's power in it and greatness. It takes courage. It's a mark of courage because it always involves risk. In your exploration of vulnerability, move at your own pace. Choose the people you let into your life and choose how far you open up to them. Owning those choices always says, I am enough.